Good afternoon, world. This is your favorite podcast, Cambrian Explosion, coming to you with your hosts, Yawer and Nabil. And today we want to talk about, uh, democracy.
Yeah, I want to start off with a little anecdote, which I think is very relevant to how Canadian elections tend to be. And that anecdote is about my aunt. And she, in the last elections, she came over and she went like, I voted strategically and I voted for the Liberal Party. And I went like, did you check the riding? Did you know that in your riding, the NDP was the leader, and so in your riding, voting strategically would have meant voting with the NDP. She was very disappointed at having voted for the Liberal Party because her heart, in terms of policies, is definitely with the NDP. Um, and it highlights some of the challenges around strategic voting and other issues that are there in what we see. And keep in mind, elections are a technology at the end of the day for understanding representation, etc. And it's a broad definition of technology, but they are technology.
Yeah, it's a system for choosing your representatives. You have to have some kind of a system, otherwise, it's chaos. So we came up with this specific system, which works allegedly for the purpose.
Yeah, but I think there's some challenges because I mean, let's start off with what is strategic voting. Like I use that term, but what does that mean to
Right.
you?
So, Nabil's aunt and many of us, we are we often have to think about how to vote strategically in elections because there are certain uh, candidates that we support, but other candidates are more viable, mainstream, and we don't want certain other candidates to come in and get the elected. So this is like, I mean, this is kind of like a very super known thing to do. Like people have been doing it for a long time, and uh, we think we know how to do it, but often we find out that we didn't actually do it properly, and we accidentally didn't vote for perhaps the person that we wanted to or should have. So the what is the problem that's being solved by strategic voting? Well, the problem with voting in general is that right now you can vote for only one candidate in any particular position, right? So
Mm.
you have to make a choice. You can't just vote for any number of candidates who you like. You have to vote for one. So only one candidate can be elected at the end of the day, which is fine, but then you have to choose one specific and give them the vote. So it uh, fundamentally there is a conflict between the number of candidates on any ballot and the single candidate who will ultimately get elected. And to resolve this conflict, we've come up with many different strategies for how to choose and pick, and what's our criteria, and what's the party, and what's the platform and policies and the electoral promises that they make. And all of these things combine into one giant, like, kind of thing that you have to track in your head and make a decision ultimately at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, it's you have to make a decision whether you um, take your cue from newspapers like the Toronto Star endorsing the NDP, Liberals and Greens in the last election to prevent a PC majority, which of course ultimately failed. Now Doug Ford got elected, um, but it's kind of it's funny because we have these workarounds. Strategic voting is, after all, a workaround for the problem of having multiple candidates but only a single winner.
Well, I think part of the thing that I find frustrating with the concept of strategic voting. There are parties and there are policies and there are issues that aren't necessarily mainstream but do need to become mainstream. And I find that, like, if you're in the Green Party and there's always strategic voting going on, you're never going to be able to push the policies that you believe need to be pushed, because your voters are always there's always additional policies that your voters are voting for. But also part of the thing is that because the Conservative and Liberal parties and the NDP, those three parties have such a large vote share, there's a belief that some of those smaller parties and therefore some of those smaller issues can never win. So they never get, even if they could win at a point, they, just because of that belief, there's always that, um, those sets of issues and that they are bringing and policies that they are bringing are always left on the side, and they're never discussed. And some of the most interesting developments actually come from from some of those parties, from those points of view. And and so, like, I think you say that strategic voting is a way to get around some of those things, some of the challenges in in the electoral system. Um,
Yeah, there are two ways of thinking about it, right?
yeah,
So the first school of thought is that strategic voting is actually we should not be doing it. We
yeah,
should always vote for our honest, preferred candidate and
mm,
not vote strategically for other candidates
mm,
because we think that they are more mainstream. Because the argument goes that if we vote honestly, then it will help our candidate ultimately, and it might even push them into a mainstream position and even in one day help them win. The other argument is that in a voting system where you have to vote for only one winner
mm,
in on the ballot, um, it mathematically does not make sense to vote for anybody else except for the two major parties, because there is a kind of sociological phenomenon by which such democracies end up with two major parties. The case in point being US Democrats, Republicans, Canada Liberals, and Conservatives. These two major parties uh, are split almost 50-50 down the middle between the, for votes of the general public, and everybody else is pushed into such a tiny minority that um, voting for them is basically throwing away your vote. These two viewpoints are in obviously in
stark,
direct,
yeah,
stark opposition to each other.
yeah.
So, what's actually the way forward?
But well, to me, the question really becomes, how do you what are the outcomes that you want out of election system? Because if you if you end up with a two-party system, you'll end up also with what happens in the US. More, like 30% to 50% of the population is just disengaged from the um, electoral cycle. Even in Ontario, as this has folded out, uh, you know, we had the lowest voter turnout in an Ontario provincial election at 43% of eligible voters. Um, uh, this isn't good. We want more representation, not less representation, and we want policies that are supported by more people. Um, and less disenfranchisement. So what makes a good electoral system in your opinion?
So, yeah, so the problem that you just pointed out, people are just not voting, and the current elected representatives, as you said, are elected by less than half of the population who could vote. This is a really big problem. And why is this happening? I mean, this is a difficult question to answer. We are saying that it's disengagement. It's people are fed up and tired and
Mm.
don't have the mental space or energy to deal with this system where their votes are such a, theoretically it's so simple. You just vote for one person or candidate or party, but in reality it turns into this giant complication where you have to think strategically. You have to look at all of the platforms and promises and all that stuff. So, but what's the alternative, right? Like, what can be done about this? Like, well, first we need to understand that what actually are good outcomes and what do those look like. The first and most important one is obviously high turnout.
Yeah.
Um, you cannot have a viable system of representation when less than half of your voters are voting.
Yeah.
So most people are not actually electing the representatives. This is really bad. You could force people to vote. You could, again, this is not something that I think that an open society should do to force people. Although it is a civic, it can be considered a civic duty, one of the most important ones. But still, I mean, to me, it would be a very difficult proposition.
Well,
Um,
I think you wouldn't need to force people to vote if
mhm,
they believe that their vote counted,
mhm,
and I think it talks to uh, how effective your vote is. So you could call it a spoilage rate, in that sense, like how
mhm.
many votes are actually measured in terms of the final outcome and have an impact on that. Not I know we can talk about ballot spoilage in terms of wasted ballots, right?
Right, right.
And one of the ways to talk about wasted ballots is wasted ballots because they were improperly input, right? That's a separate
Sure,
technological issue.
sure.
But the social issue and the psychological issue is, hey, if I vote, will my vote count?
Right. So obviously, in any election with multiple candidates, there will be one winner, and all of the other candidates' votes will be essentially thrown away or wasted.
Yeah,
If your candidate does not win, your vote is essentially amounting to zero.
yeah,
It's a zero sum game.
yeah.
There is a thought process here that look, why don't we turn this from a zero sum game into an actual uh, truly representative
Yeah.
system where everybody's votes are counted and impact their representation proportionately. So if candidate, or party X gets 50% of the vote, party Y gets 25%, and party Z gets 25%, then in any legislative system, they should be allocated the an amount of seats that are proportional to their votes. So
Mm.
then you would have a proportional representation system.
Well, but that's one way of making it count, right? There's more than one way of making it count. So proportionality is one of them. Um, Having to to vote on multiple candidates is another way. Having to vote on issues is a third way, right? Um, I think I also want to put in a couple of other outcomes that I think are that are important. So I think justice delayed is justice denied. So the election should be or the process should be timely. It should be transparent and auditable, because that's the other thing that's the one thing Trump has been claiming, the Biden Trump elections weren't, right? Transparent and auditable. So that's important. Uh, representation of issues rather than personality. So, as I said, are you voting on a person, or are you voting for the actual issues? And is there a way to capture key issues in the voting system itself? And then it shouldn't, like, we have had multiple elections in a very short space of time for city, for the province, for the country.
Federal, yeah.
So and each cycle of election does cost us money. So it should also be something that is relatively cheaper to do, and easy to implement, so that everybody can follow. So I think that's to me the matrix that I see. Do you see anything else to be added in that matrix of, like, what makes a good election?
Yeah, you know, concretely having to wait a long time and having controversies about the count and recount, having to recount and having to, be not being able to understand how the votes were being counted and how the winners were being decided. This erodes confidence in democracy. All of these things
Hmm,
are super important.
hmm,
Um, there are systems and methods which can improve or move the scale in either direction
hmm,
in these kinds of issues. For example, one method that has been tried recently in Ontario
hmm,
is that Ontario, until recently at the municipal level, was able to choose a different voting system than our usual choose one voting system. So the different one was ranked ballot
hmm,
voting, or also known as instant runoff voting (IRV).
hmm,
And this was tried in London, Ontario. And in general, the kind of this new system was well received
hmm,
um, in London, Ontario, and attracted, I believe, more candidates than would otherwise have, uh, stood for election.
hmm,
But ultimately, what happened? It was rolled back by Doug Ford because they said, the Ford government said that we don't want complicated, expensive, different methods. In democracy, we want to keep everything the same so that it's fair for everybody, or cheap.
Didn't Trudeau make some promises around the election, around his first election as well, for changing the voting
Right.
system? And what did he promise?
So back in 2015, when as we remember, when we had the red wave, and the Liberals came into power after Stephen Harper's government was
Hmm,
ousted,
hmm,
and around that time, Justin Trudeau had been fairly um, assertive about this election promise that he had made, that he would uh, make sure that that was the last election where Canadians would vote via the choose one voting method or plurality voting.
hmm,
He distinctly promised that, he made that exact promise.
hmm,
But since coming into power, he has more or less ignored that promise and made some kind of justifications that, well, Canadians aren't really interested in this kind of electoral reform. He claimed to have done a Statistics Canada survey, which was apparently an online survey which didn't restrict anybody from participating, so anyone could go into the survey and fill it out. And they asked questions like that, which were slanted in a way that would kind of discourage changes. So it's not even clear what he, what that whether he was basing his conclusions on an unbiased survey or a sample. But it is clear that many people were disappointed by this broken promise, and that there is still a lot of interest throughout Canada for improving, electoral reform.
I'm gonna ask you this question slightly differently. Uh, And the question to me really becomes, hey, I'm seeing over here the when there was an opportunity for the conservatives to experiment with it, they nixed it at the Ontario municipal level, right? When Trudeau made a promise, the Liberal Party made a promise to deliver this change to Canadians, they also nixed it. They also got rid of it. Now, to me, it's a catch 22 for these parties, both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party. They are the dominant parties. So for them, not changing the electoral system, whatever the reasoning might be, is the
in their
whatever
interest.
official reason they might give, it's in their interest for the
Yeah,
system to
Germain.
continue, yeah, to continue as it is, because
They have no incentive to change.
they have no incentive to change,
Yeah.
except for the incentive which we looked at earlier,
Mhm.
which is that there is uh, more and more people getting disenfranchised from the
Mm.
election system,
Disengaged. Yeah.
disengaged. And what I understand of the election system is that it's also, every 4 years it allows you to have some of the society's pent up pressure, anger, etc., around issues to be to be let out, because they believe that by voting they're making a difference to society, right? That's the psychology behind.
Well, that's the thought process behind voting in elections: is that we choose
Yeah.
the people who will represent us,
Yes.
and we can change that choice.
Yes, and so to me, the question really becomes, like, there are indicators that people do want to change something about the elections. It might not be the actual voting mechanism, but disengaged voters means that there's something wrong in the election system. One of the things that could be wrong is basically how it is being run, whether this current formulation of it, and whether we have approval rating or ranked ballot or some other form, is and we might not have decided what it is, but it's worth discussing, and it's not the two major parties who are going to lead us there. So we how do we find a way to get there and have those serious discussions and get the two major parties involved as well?
Well, the proof is in the pudding. The two major parties don't have the incentive in Canada
Hmm.
or in the US for
Hmm.
that matter. Who does then? Well, third parties like the NDP in Canada.
Hmm.
In fact, there are, in like, it's my personal belief. I'm not basing this on any real facts, but I do believe that there is a lot of support for the NDP, but people are afraid to vote for them because of what we said earlier: strategic voting and letting the conservatives into power again. And the NDP loses support because of this issue. And I feel that electoral reform would really be in their interest, because they would get, they would be able to get a true measure of the support that they have in Canada when people are not scared of voting for them. Uh, it's a system of fear, I think, that
Hmm.
keeps us locked in this two-way kind of face-off
Hmm.
with the two major parties.
Hmm.
It's disengagement. People are fed up, and most people don't even vote.
Hmm.
And I mean, you mentioned earlier that the voting, the whole point of the idea behind voting is that we come out every X number of years and, make our voices heard and our frustrations heard with the current government and change the government if we want. But that's, in reality, that ends up not really making any difference, because the two major parties, they act on in almost exactly the same way, except a few words are different here and there. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they act exactly the same way when they're in power. So
I think I
what
think
really changes?
I think, and this is, I think, a great spot to actually um, um, talk to the audience here. We highlighted some issues. We highlighted what strategic voting is. We talked about, a bit about approval voting and ranked ballot. Um, in fact, I'm gonna after I frame this question for the audience, I would love to have your breakdown of what each one of these is as a closer to the podcast. But I think it's a great question for the audience. Here are some issues that we highlighted. Here are some challenges that we highlighted. Do you agree with us? If you agree with us or disagree, please let us know. And if you do agree with us and you think that the two major parties are not going to bring this issue up and not going to change the system, then how do we go about changing the election system uh, and bringing the two major parties to actually agree with this? I want to throw that question out to the audience. If we can. Um, but yeah, I also want to come back to you and actually ask you on what the two three different formats are that are available for voting. Like you understand these better than I do, and you always explain them to me. So there is ranked ballot. What is that?
So,
What is first past? What are the two
sure.
three? What are these two three things?
So, like I mentioned, choose one voting, plurality voting. This is our current system. It's also known as first past the post. Like you pick one candidate from the ballot, and that is the candidate who you vote for, and all of the votes are counted up, and the candidate with the most votes wins. That's what we have right now.
Yeah.
So what's by contrast, I mentioned earlier in London, Ontario, they tried ranked ballots. And what's ranked ballots? Well, it's a system where you have to rank all of the candidates on each ballot in order. So you as a voter go in and you rank each candidate with the each person is assigned you assign a single rank to each candidate, and all the ranks have to be different. So rank 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. And there is a system by which all of these rankings are counted up, and then they are uh, kind of measured against each other, and then the rankings are redistributed among the highest ranking candidates. And then this process goes on and on over and over again in a loop until we reach one candidate who, through this process of redistribution of rankings, reaches more than 50% or the majority of the votes or ranks. So, if you want to understand this process in more detail, I would definitely recommend looking up instant runoff voting and seeing how that works. Personally, I think it's a super complicated method.
Mhm.
There and it takes a lot of time to count these ballots and rankings and redistribute them and run multiple rounds of runoffs, because you have to verify all of these things, right? You can't just have a computer do it. And in Canada, we vote by paper vote, so you can't, again, even if you have a computer account, do your computer scans and count the ballots like that. You still have to have humans who verify them. So to me, I'm biased, but I will explicitly say that I favor one particular method, which is called approval voting, which is a system where you have a ballot which looks almost exactly like what we have today. You have a ballot with checkboxes for multiple candidates, and you can check and vote for uh, any number of candidates on the ballot. And each of your checks counts as a vote for that candidate. And the way that this differs from first past the post, what we have right now, is that you don't have to, you're not restricted to just one choice. You can choose all of the people who you find acceptable, who you approve of. So if you like the NDP, you can vote for them. If you accept liberals as well, then you can vote for them. If you like Green, you can vote for them. Conservative, Bloc Québécois, etc., etc. You can vote for whoever you want. You're not restricted, and your ballot won't be thrown away if you vote for multiple. All of the votes will be counted. They're added up. They're summed up in just the normal way that you would expect. Each vote for each candidate is summed up, and at the end of the day, whoever has the most votes wins. There's no runoff rounds. There's no redistribution of rankings. There's nothing like that. It's just adding up. And to me, I vastly prefer this because of its simplicity. It's cheaper to implement, educate people about how to do it. With ranked ballots, you have to have a lot of education campaigns about, oh, you have to rank people like this and then like that. With approval voting, there's nothing. You just say to just check all the boxes for any of the candidates that you like, and that's it. We'll just count them.
Very cool. I think it's very cool to learn about these different systems. Uh, I like the idea of being able to vote on issues, but I don't think that that's something that's coming up anytime soon, and I don't know if there's any methodologies for that.
So one thing is that there could be an indirect impact when you have systems which allow for ranking or voting for more candidates than we have right now.
Yes.
Then it encourages more candidates to stand up for election than we have right now. And it encourages a diversity of candidates. This is, for example, we saw this in London, Ontario. More diverse candidates stood for election than would ordinarily. Um, they were convinced to do so because of the voting, the different voting system, the innovation. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, I would have to say my closing argument is that, as we were saying earlier, every X number of years, voting is fine, but democracy is about more than just voting every X number of years, right? Democracy is when citizens actually get involved and push for changes uh, via whatever democratic means, whether that's voting or by calling up their representatives and making a case for why certain things should be supported, certain initiatives should be done. And an example of this is we have a citizens' assembly on electoral reform in Canada, which is actually ongoing. And it recognizes that our democratic systems need improving, and uh, a citizens' assembly could be an acceptable or could be an effective way to bring about the agreement and the legitimacy to do that.
But I before we got into the different types of electoral system, I left a question with the audience. I think this is one methodology for that, and I'd love for the audience to go explore this as well and see what's happening. It's going to be in the show notes. Please do check them out. And I think this is a great closer for the podcast as well, because it leaves us with something to explore and something to share with the audience, which they can explore and see if how they align with some of these issues. So that would
Yeah,
be a goodbye from our side.
yeah, it's kind of democracy is in your hands.
Democracy is in your hands. Take care. Bye bye. We'll talk to you next time.
Cheers.